Welcome to Daily Drive for Friday, June 19th, 2026. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, GM's Oshawa plant is about to lose most of its production. Waymo issues its second recall in a month, and a federal investigation is now underway. And after nearly 13 years, JLR's top North American executive is out. Plus, our own Dan Shine sits down with two attorneys from Troutman Pepper Locke to talk about the FTC's advertising crackdown on dealerships and what it means for the industry going forward.
Other dealers could also look into this kind of practice. So now you have that kind of over your shoulder. It's not just the big regulator, it's your competitor down the street.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. GM's Oshawa plant in Ontario is losing production fast. Industry analysts at Auto Forecast Solutions say GM is set to drop the light-duty Silverado 1500 from the plant before year's end, leaving only the heavy-duty variant. AFS CEO Joe McCabe puts it plainly, that's enough to keep the lights on, but just barely. Annual output could fall from around 150,000 vehicles to 50,000. Unifor Local 222 President Jeff Gray says the union is extremely concerned and still waiting on GM for answers. Waymo is recalling nearly 3,900 robo-taxis after the vehicles were found driving past ramp closure signs and into active freeway construction zones. It happened more than a dozen times since early April in California and Arizona. Waymo has since updated its software and says the problem is fixed. But this is the company's second recall in just over a month. Last time, the vehicles were driving into flooded roads. Separately, NHTSA is investigating after a Waymo vehicle struck a child near a Santa Monica school back in January, causing minor injuries. After nearly 13 years, Joe Eberhardt is out at JLR, one of the longest runs of any North American auto CEO. A company spokesperson confirmed he left to pursue new opportunities. He'll stay on as a consultant through year's end, focusing on JLR's growing partnership with Stellantis. Chief Growth Officer Leonard Hornick takes over on an interim basis. The timing is notable. Eberhardt's exit comes as JLR bets big on the U.S. market and pulls back from China. And those are today's headlines. You can find more details on all those stories at autonews.com. Joining me now is Paige Hodder, retail reporter here at Automotive News, who's been working on our upcoming Top 100 F&I section. Paige, welcome to Daily Drive.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Paige. So the list is in its second year now. Are there any trends emerging that surprised you as you were reporting this out?
So the biggest trend that came out in my coverage, both of last year's list and this year's list, was training. And, last year I was getting hints of like stores are really starting to invest in training as not something sort of sporadic, but more like as a part of their day-to-day process. And this year, looking at 2025 data, of course, we really saw that come into fruition. Stores are invested in training specifically to finalize a standardized process for the F&I office. So, I spoke to sort of an analyst trainer who works with dealerships, and she said that, for a long time, a lot of dealership F&I offices relied on sort of a superstar, like someone who just could sell you anything. And, maybe a store had one of those guys and he kind of just carried the office. And that was how they kind of got on for a while. But now, especially as dealership groups are consolidating and growing and as the market's becoming more competitive, that doesn't cut it anymore. And it definitely doesn't provide consistent profits and consistent growth. And so dealership groups are really focused on like, how can I make sure that all of my team members are performing on a really consistent basis, and what kind of process makes that happen?
Now, what's the one thing that separated the dealership groups that climbed the rankings from those that fell?
It is that standardized process. I talked to a couple different kinds of dealers for this project. Some of them grew their revenue by like double-digit numbers, and they did that just by making some changes, some small changes. One of them I spoke to had created a new management position, someone specifically in charge of making sure everyone's hitting their benchmarks and everyone's keeping up to date with their training. And, that really paid off in their revenue year over year. Another group I spoke to was sort of a different scenario. On the surface, it looked like an easy sort of answer. They had bought like 12 stores last year. And so, of course, they had more F&I revenue. But when you look under the surface, I spoke to the dealer there and he said, every single one of the stores they bought had a different F&I process. And so it was kind of a large undertaking to get all of those people on the same page and making consistent profits, especially if someone had been doing the same type of thing for a really long time, maybe something that worked okay, but wasn't optimized, wasn't the most efficient, wasn't the most effective. And so they really wanted to make sure each F&I office was doing the best it could. And that required some really consistent training, some really, intentional intervention. And, they said that they're just kind of starting to see those new stores really keep up with the stores that had been following the process, months and months after they acquired them.
Paige, before we end, how can people read more about all of this?
So the project goes live and it'll be online early next week. I wrote a story breaking down all of the strategies that the top growers on the list, used last year. There's also another story about the dealership groups that made it onto the 100 million club list. And then I wrote another story about, how you can make it on this list and how you can, compete with these groups and really get into the numbers. And if you want to really deep dive into the list, you can go to our research and data center where there's a breakdown of a lot of the different data points.
Perfect. Paige Hodder, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, attorneys Brooke Conkle and Chris Capurso of Troutman Pepper Locke on the FTC's warning letters to 97 dealerships and what dealers need to do now. That's next on Daily Drive.
Navigation can go beyond just marks on the road. And this week on Shift, we're looking at the future of automotive navigation with AI.
TomTom's Senior Vice President of Product Engineering, Manuela Locarno Ajay, talks about developing a map with real-time information at the lane level.
It's not just knowing the traffic on the road, but the traffic per lane, for example. Or if there is a hazard on the road, in which lane the hazard is.
Locarno Ajay also explains how AI can lead to better interactions with voice for navigation, how TomTom is building trust with AI, and how automakers are reacting to the new technology.
Join us for Shift, available this Sunday wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Kellen Walker. The FTC sent warning letters to 97 dealerships back in March, flagging 6 advertising practices it considers illegal. The move caught a lot of people off guard. This is, after all, a Trump administration FTC. Since then, the agency has held 2 webinars with the industry, released the full list of named dealerships, and left a lot of dealers wondering what exactly they need to fix and who might come after them next. Automotive News senior retail editor Dan Shine sat down with Brooke Conkle and Chris Capurso, attorneys at Troutman Pepper Locke who represent dealers. They break down what the letters actually say, why state attorneys general may be the bigger long-term threat, and what every dealer should be doing right now to get their advertising in order.
Brooke, Chris, thanks so much for joining me on the F&I Friday edition of Daily Drive.
Thanks for having us.
I want to talk about the FTC, and they've been in the news with their dealership work for a few weeks now. Guys, going back to March when they sent out these 97 letters to dealerships saying, we think you might be violating one of 6 principles that we think you shouldn't be doing. And then it's just become a really kind of a shot across the bow to dealerships. And it's really, I think, gotten the attention of the automotive retail community. Brooke, why would we be surprised by this action by the FTC? I think there was an understanding that, there's going to be no regulation. It's going to be the fox guard in the hen house and, while the Trump administration's in office. But this came as kind of a shock to folks.
Dan, you're exactly right. And what we've heard from a lot of our sort of industry contacts is, wait, guys, we thought we were in the clear. And, when you read the warning letters, it really does sort of outline that the FTC's position is that we are still in sort of a stated price universe. And a lot of the elements of sort of the total cash price that were defined in the CARS rule, we're seeing those same threads in these warning letters. And so I think it was a legitimate surprise to a lot of people that this current iteration of the FTC is really viewing sort of the total price disclosure in the same way as the prior administration did.
Chris, since those letters went out in March, the FTC is, and I guess I'm kind of ask you kind of why you think they've been doing a job as far as communicating to dealers. Since those letters went out, they had a webinar that was kind of a kind of a mess. They had a second webinar that I think went better. How would you gauge how the FTC is kind of communicating about these letters and getting its message out to dealerships?
Yeah, I think, to Brooke's point, the kind of surprise that the FTC is doing this type of stuff. Maybe you could see it coming from other signals, but like just the general, this is the Trump administration. This is the second time we've been through this. We weren't really expecting this type of action. And I do think, the idea of webinar, the idea of working with industry is something that, it's always been something leveled at the Democratic administrations and the regulatory agencies there, where it's the enforcement by blog post, and you just kind of, they send out their proclamations from on high and it's industry deal with it. It's not very friendly. So I think the webinars were an attempt to kind of work with industry in a way to kind of let them know what was going on. Now, and as you said, the first one didn't go well. The reviews were not great. And the second one, they brought in the heavy hitters. They brought in Chairperson Ferguson. They brought in Director Mafarage to kind of go through all these things. And NADA asked them some very pointed questions. And, to the extent they could answer, they tried to answer. And I think that's them trying to kind of differentiate themselves from the prior administration by saying, hey, we're doing this type of stuff, but we understand that industry has concerns, that industry needs to know how to actually comply with these things. And we're going to make an effort to try to help you out and help you try to see where we're coming from.
Brooke, for so long, these 97 dealerships were anonymous. We didn't know who they were and if they were big groups or just single stores. And then kind of out of the blue, the FTC releases the list of the 97 on a Friday, I think I might add, I think late in the day on a Friday. What do you think the reason is behind that action? I mean, I don't think they had to. I don't know if there was a lot of pressure for them to do that, or it was just kind of seemed like an odd action for them. What do you think maybe was the prod behind that?
Yeah, I think in part it shows sort of kind of a diversity of options, is that they're sort of looking at the industry as a whole. They're looking at the big guys, they're looking at the mid-sized guys, they're looking at the little guys, and saying, to Chris's point, one of the things that they talked about in the NADA webinar was the question, do you have the horses for this? And by kind of releasing the names of the dealerships, one, they're kind of putting a target on those dealerships. So either from us, the FTC, or from state regulators, or from plaintiffs' lawyers, you guys have got to change your practices. And then, we still have that interplay of federal and state. And we don't often see sort of a Republican-led federal agency pairing up with, state AGs. But we may see something like that coming.
Chris, talk about UDAP and how that is at play. I guess maybe UDAP for unfair, deceptive actions and practices. I should know
unfair, deceptive actions
your
practices,
acronym.
or if you want to go to the CFPB standard, the double A UDAP.
UDAP.
Yeah, you gotta drag it out to really emphasize this, the CFPB. But yeah, I mean, all of this from the FTC is under the guise of their Section 5 UDAP authority. And the interesting part, and is exactly what Brooke alluded to, state attorneys general have very similar authority, either exactly the same, unfair, deceptive acts or practices, or it's deceptive trade practices or misleading or deceptive trade practices. There's some kind of power in all of the state's attorney general to regulate this kind of behavior. And it's then the question, okay, the FTC, a Trump FTC, has now said, hey, these practices are UDAP. And UDAP is always kind of I call it the squishy standard. It's it when you see it. There's not a law right on point to say that this isn't something we want to have happen. So we're just going to put it under UDAP. We don't think it should be happening. It's UDAP. And obviously in the more, Democratic administrations, the UDAP standard is much squishier. And it's, they roll a lot of things into it. And you don't typically see it being used kind of over aggressively in Republican administrations. But now we have this edict from on high from the FTC with their UDAP authority saying, hey, these price advertising practices are UDAP. The state AGs are fully within their power to say, hey, they've got a point. We should be pursuing these same practices. And now we have a list of 97 people who allegedly are doing it by the FTC. It's an interesting thing where, yes, this is the FTC pointing out these specific practices under its own UDAP authority, but it's something that the states could also get involved with. And interestingly enough, in the Lindsay action, which came out just after, the 97 letters went out, Chairperson Ferguson almost lamented the fact that the FTC doesn't have the penalty authority that it used to, while saying that it was totally right to take it away from us. Like we were misinterpreting the law that we had. Like we don't have that authority, but we should, is the way his concurrence went. So it was a very interesting kind of trying to play both sides of the coin, being, oh yeah, they were totally right to take it away from us, but we need it. So it'll be interesting to see, to Brooke's point, will they partner up with some state attorneys general who do have a little bit heftier penalty authority? It remains to be seen, but it kind of gets to this idea that federal, state, UDAP is going to be an issue all over. And now we've got some evidence from the FTC that maybe state AGs can roll with.
So, Brooke, if I'm a dealer, if I've got one store, I have 20 stores, and this has all kind of been going on for a few months, and what kind of clarity am I looking for? What are dealers looking for from the FTC? What kind of clarity from them do they want?
I'm not sure that anybody in the industry is hoping for an enforcement action, but oftentimes that is the way that you get that clarity, where the FTC points to specific advertisements and says, this is what you did wrong. This is what it should have been. This is the harm that it caused. And sort of creating that through line of this works, this doesn't, this is how it should look. That provides that clarity. And in the prior administration, so many folks in the industry were upset about sort of the direction that things had gone. But that said, we have pretty clear standards of this works, this doesn't, this is a problem. And I think that that's really what the industry is looking for, potentially without an enforcement action, but really kind of drawing those lines of this is how the price was advertised, this is why it doesn't match up.
If we're looking down the road, Brooke, a little bit further, what should, I guess, dealerships be thinking about going forward? That, how are they going to fix their, advertising, their web advertising, their social media advertising? What are kind of the fixes they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, there are really kind of two that really come to mind. And the first is, going back to the letters, that stated price. What is included in the price? Are you including all required fees? Are doc fees in there? Is the consumer going to be able to walk into your dealership and purchase a vehicle essentially for the price that was advertised, plus taxes? Is that what they're going to be able to do when they go into your dealership? And then second, just as you mentioned, it's consistency. Dealers have so many ways to advertise a vehicle these days that making sure that if you're making a change on one medium, you're making it on another. So if the price is one place on Facebook and it's stated differently on Instagram, that's a problem. And so really clarifying what your price is and then making sure that that price is consistent regardless of the medium in which you're advertising.
Chris, I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball. See what I did there?
Oh, I do.
What does this mean going forward down the road a year? Are we going to hear from the FTC? Are we going to see 97 letters again in the next 6 months? Or is this maybe a little blip, just a little warning shot, and the FTC will kind of go back to sleep for the next 2 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And, Brooke had alluded to the NADA webinar where it was specifically asked, do they have the horses to do this? And then rather brilliantly, you mentioned, well, your other dealers could also look into this kind of practice. So now you have that kind of over your shoulder. It's not just the big regulator, it's your competitor down the street. which is its own level of paranoia that could
Right. The FTC kind of said, we can't do it all. So the guy down the road is being cheating, or tell us, rat him out.
Right. And I mean, that's effective, because if you think somebody is looking at everything you're doing all the time, compliance all of a sudden comes to the top of the mind, rather than kind of being this background. Oh, well, we have our policies and procedures in place. We should be thinking about these things. But if someone's overlooking what you're doing, then it's a little bit scarier. I think over the next year, what I'd be looking for is definitely the state angle, and see if more state AGs start to look into this type of stuff. Because, I mean, we always discuss, like, AGs are political animals, and the more complaints they're going to get, the more they're going to act on it. It's not a blue versus red issue. It's, if enough consumers think that price advertising is deceptive to them, they're going to complain about it, and then the AG is going to act on it. And with all of this being in the news now, I mean, it's such a headline, the 97 letters, right? Like, and the fact that deceptive price advertising is coming out, maybe more consumers are becoming aware of it, and then they complain. And then the AGs are more aware of it because the FTC said something, and now they're seeing the complaints, and it's, oh, well, we got to do something about it. So I'd be curious in the next year if they start to act a little bit more. On the FTC front, I think we could see a few things, but again, to Chairperson Ferguson's own point in his concurrence, they don't necessarily have the penalty authority to deal with this stuff. They do have kind of the authority for, like, redress and things like that. But I think it's a little bit harder in the advertising context, because, you have to prove the injury. Did you buy the car based on that one advertisement that you saw? And the redress could be just the difference between, the differences in the price. It's a little bit more complicated than just slapping a fine on somebody for a UDAP violation. So it'll be interesting to see how the next year plays out.
Speaking of, state AGs, Letitia James in New York's very active, and I think just, had some action against Nissan Motor Acceptance Corp, getting some refunds, and going to audit the rest of the, dealerships in New York State to make sure they're doing the right thing. So, like you said, they're political animals too. They want to score points with voters, and, and she's one of the more active. I think we get a lot of press release from her about taking action against, dealerships and all. Brooke, last question to you, and that's about people we haven't talked about yet, and that's the consumer, you and me and everyone else who shops at dealerships, buy cars, lease cars, buy a used car. How has all this impacted the consumer?
Well, it's really interesting because, Chris and I have seen data that consumers are influenced by price disparities as minimal as $25. So when you're seeing, doc fees that are, regulated by state, if those doc fees that are permissible are in some cases up to $1,000. And so if those are not being disclosed in a full price, then you're going to see those little differences make a big difference at the end of the day when you're buying a car. And so we can bristle at some of the requirements in sort of the 97 letters, what the FTC has outlined. But at the end of the day, a stated price regime does work better for the consumer. It does lead to a better experience. And if it's done properly throughout the industry, it levels the playing field because, just as Chris mentioned, you want good dealerships getting good customers. And so if we've got a level playing field of everybody disclosing price in the same way, then that leads to better results in individual deals and repeat customers.
Brooke, Chris, really informative discussion. I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Brooke Conkle and Chris Capurso of Troutman Pepper Lock spoke with our own Dan Shine. That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer, as well as our own Paige Hodder and Richard Truitt for their reporting for today's podcast. We also had reporting from David Kennedy of our sibling publication, Automotive News Canada. You can get the latest news on the FTC's dealer advertising crackdown, GM's Oshawa plant situation, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back over the weekend for our weekend drive edition of the show. Our own Michael Martinez and Larry Velaquette break down the week's biggest stories, including the UAW's convention this week, and what it tells us about Shawn Fain's chances of winning another term as the union's president.
4 years ago, Shawn Fain was actually a sergeant at arms at the Constitutional Convention, assigned to the bowels of the convention center basement. And 4 years later, he's literally at the top on the stage presiding over the convention. So great rise. It's just, I think for some people, they wanted a little more reform out of that reform candidate.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we've covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.